At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. I want to say thanks to everyone who came out yesterday for our Saturday Secular Social, which is the third Saturday of the month at 3 o'clock at Browers. So everyone is invited to that, okay? I also would like to give a shout out to Troy, who is our treasurer. If you'd like to make a donation, please do so with him, or there's probably a jar, or you could do it online as well. So the donations just go for renting the room, but if you enjoy the space, please help if you can, and also invite a friend if you can. That helps a lot too. So the way we do it is the members ourselves give the talks, and then afterwards we get into a circle and we have a discussion circle. So we do this every Sunday at noon in the same room. We've been doing it for 4 years that way. So next week's talk is on our culture of the sort of division between liberals and conservatives, and how we're really having trouble being in dialogue with each other and just sort of talking past each other. I'm making that part up, but it's going to be a talk by Ryan next week, and I'm guessing that that's what, because it's going to be on sort of the culture wars that are going on right now. And then right now we have a talk on political correctness from the liberal perspective. So help me welcome Jack.
Hi everyone. I wanted to talk to you today about something that's been on my mind recently, and that is some liberal criticism of political correctness. Before I get started though, I want to get a pulse on the sentiment in the room. By show of hands, how many of you think that political correctness is a problem in this country? Okay, some?
Definition.
Okay, one more. For this one, I'll need a number. Just go ahead and shout it out. What percentage of Americans do you think would say that political correctness is a problem in this country? 70%?
50.
All right, so I heard some numbers like 70, 50, 30. It's a good mix of numbers here. So we'll see the answer pretty soon as I start off with an article from The Atlantic called Americans Strongly Dislike PC Culture. This is by Yasha Monk and was published in October 2018. On social media, the country seems to divide into two neat camps. Call them the woke and the resentful. Team resentment is manned, very much pun intended, by people who are predominantly old and almost exclusively white. Team woke is young, likely to be female, and predominantly black, brown, or Asian, although white allies do their part. These teams are roughly equal in number, and they disagree most vehemently, as well as most routinely, about the catch-all known as political correctness. Reality, though, is nothing like this. As scholars Stephen Hawkins, Daniel Yudkin, Miriam Juan-Torres, and Tim Dixon argue in a report titled Hidden Tribes, a study of America's polarized landscapes, most Americans don't fit into either of these camps. They also share more in common than the daily fights on social media might suggest, including a general aversion to PC culture. The study was written by an organization called More in Common, an organization founded in memory of Joe Cox, the British MP who was murdered in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. It is based on a nationally representative poll with 8,000 respondents, 30 one-hour interviews, and 6 focus groups conducted from December 2017 to September 2018. If you look at what Americans have to say on issues such as immigration, the extent of white privilege, and the prevalence of sexual harassment, the authors argue, 7 distinct cultures emerge. From left to right, we have progressive activists, traditional liberals, passive liberals, the politically disengaged, moderates, traditional conservatives, and devoted conservatives. According to the report, 25% of Americans are traditional or devoted conservatives, and their views are far outside the American mainstream. Some 8% of Americans are progressive activists, and their views are even less typical. By contrast, the 2/3 of Americans who don't belong to either extreme constitute an exhausted majority. Their members, quote, share a sense of fatigue with our polarized national conversation, a willingness to be flexible in their political viewpoints, and a lack of voice in the national conversation. That's a full 2/3 of Americans. Most members of the exhausted majority, and then some, dislike political correctness. Among the general population, a full 80% believe that political correctness is a problem in our country. Even young people are uncomfortable with it, including 74% from the ages 24 to 29, and 79% under the age of 24. On this particular issue, the woke are in a clear minority across all ages. Youth isn't a good proxy for support of political correctness, and it turns out race isn't either. Whites are ever so slightly less likely than average to believe that political correctness is a problem in the country. 79% of them share this sentiment. Instead, it is Asians with 82%, Hispanics at 87%, and American Indians at 88% who are most likely to oppose political correctness. As one 40-year-old American Indian in Oklahoma said in his focus group, according to the report, quote, it seems like every day you wake up, something has changed. You say Jew or Jewish? Is it a black guy? African American? You're on your toes because you never know what to say. So political correctness is, in that sense, scary. End quote. The one part of the standard narrative that the data partially affirm is that African Americans are the most likely to support political correctness. But the difference between them and other groups is much smaller than generally supposed. 3/4 of African Americans oppose political correctness, 75%. That means that they are only 4 percentage points less likely than whites and only 5 percentage points less likely than the average to believe that political correctness is a problem. If age and race do not predict support for political correctness, what does? Income and education. While 83% of respondents who make less than 50K dislike political correctness, just 70% of those who make more than 100K are skeptical about it. And while 87% who have never attended college think that political correctness has grown to be a problem, only 66% of those with a postgraduate degree share that sentiment. Political tribe, as defined by the authors, is an even better predictor of views on political correctness. Among devoted conservatives, 97% believe that political correctness is a problem. I suppose there's no surprise there. Among traditional liberals, 61% do. Progressive activists are the only group that strongly backs political correctness. Only 30% see it as a problem, but that's still almost 1 in 3. So what does this group look like? Compared with the rest of the nationally representative polling sample, progressive activists are much more likely to be rich, highly educated, and white. They're nearly twice as likely as the average to make more than 100K per year. They're nearly 3 times as likely to have a postgraduate degree. And while 12% of the overall sample in the study is African American, only 3% of progressive activists are. With the exception of the small tribe of devoted conservatives, progressive activists are the most racially homogenous group in the country. One obvious question is what people mean by political correctness. In the extended interviews and focus groups, participants made clear that they were concerned about their day-to-day ability to express themselves. They worried that a lack of familiarity with the topic or an unthinking word choice could lead to serious social sanctions for them. But since the survey questions did not define political correctness for respondents, we cannot be sure what exactly the 80% of Americans who regard it as a problem have in mind. There is, however, plenty of additional support for the idea that the social views of most Americans are not nearly as neatly divided by age or race as is commonly believed. According to the Pew Research Center, for example, only 26% of Black Americans consider themselves liberal. And in the More in Common study, nearly half of Latinos argued that, quote, many people nowadays are too sensitive to how Muslims are treated, while 2 in 5 African Americans agreed that, quote, immigration nowadays is bad for America. In the days before the Hidden Tribes study was published, I ran a little experiment on Twitter, asking my followers to guess what the percentage of Americans who believe that political correctness is a problem in this country is. This is Yasha Monk talking. The results were striking. Nearly all of my followers underestimated the extent to which most Americans reject political correctness. Obviously, my followers on Twitter are not a representative sample of America. But as their largely supportive feelings about political correctness indicate, they're probably a decent approximation for a particular intellectual milieu to which I also belong. Politically engaged, highly educated, left-leaning Americans. The kind of people, in other words, who are in charge of universities, edit the nation's most important newspapers and magazines, and advise Democratic political candidates on their campaigns. So the fact that we are so widely off the mark in our perception of how most people feel about political correctness should probably also make us rethink some of our basic assumptions about the country. It is obvious that certain elements on the right mock instances in which political correctness goes awry in order to win the license to spew outright racial hatred. And it is understandable that, in the eyes of some progressives, this makes anybody who dares to criticize political correctness a witting tool of, or a useful idiot for, the right. But that's not fair to the Americans who feel deeply alienated by woke culture. Indeed, while 80% of Americans believe that political correctness has become a problem in the country, even more, 82%, believe that hate speech is also a problem. It turns out that while progressive activists tend to think that only hate speech is a problem, and devoted conservatives tend to think that only political correctness is a problem, a clear majority of all Americans holds a more nuanced point of view. They abhor racism, but they don't think that the way we now practice political correctness represents a promising way to overcome racial injustice. The study should also make progressives more self-critical about the way in which speech norms serve as a marker of social distinction. I don't doubt the sincerity of the affluent and highly educated people who call out others if they use problematic terms or perpetrate an act of cultural appropriation. But what the vast majority of Americans seem to see, at least according to the research conducted for Hidden Tribes, is not so much genuine concern for social justice as the preening display of cultural superiority. For the millions upon millions of Americans of all ages and all races who do not follow politics with rapt attention and who are much more worried about paying their rent than about debating the prom dress worn by a teenager in Utah, contemporary call-out culture merely looks like an excuse to mock the values or ignorance of others. As one 57-year-old woman in Mississippi fretted, quote, "The way you have to term everything just right, and if you don't term it right, you discriminate them. It's like everyone is going to be in the know of what people call themselves now, and some of us just don't know. But if you don't know, then there's something seriously wrong with you." End quote. The gap between progressive perception and the reality of public views on this issue could do damage to the institutions that the woke elite collectively run. A publication whose editors think that they represent the views of the majority of Americans when they actually speak to a small minority of the country may eventually see its influence wane and its readership decline. And a political candidate who believes she's speaking for half of the population when she's actually voicing the opinions of 1/5 is likely to lose the next election. In a democracy, it is difficult to win fellow citizens over to your own side or to build public support to remedy injustices that remain all too real when you fundamentally misunderstand how they see the world. That's the end of the article titled, Americans Strongly Dislike PC Culture. In an explainer article on Vox, that's Vox with a V, titled "The Battle Over Identity Politics Explained," Herman Lopez writes, quote, "While many white Americans feel like they can't even talk about how they feel due to what they call political correctness." Michelle Goldberg, a columnist at Slate who's interviewed dozens of people at Trump rallies, wrote that she consistently heard this from Trump supporters. Again and again, people told me, quote, "Again and again, people told me how much they resented not being able to speak their minds, though none of them wanted to articulate exactly what they were holding in. They said that they hated being shamed on social media, though they usually didn't want to say what they had been shamed for." The undertone here is that a lot of Trump supporters want to be able to say racist, sexist, or otherwise bigoted things without consequence. But another possibility is that these people want to be able to speak about issues, sometimes in a clumsy, accidentally offensive way, because they just don't know the new language of these topics, without being shamed. Writing them off as simply racist, sexist, or otherwise bigoted only makes them feel like their actual concerns about the economy, the state of the country, the size of government, and so on, are being ignored. To these people, political correctness and identity politics more broadly have, in their view, oppressed them. Later in the article, he continues, Mark Lilla, a liberal historian who wrote The End of Identity Liberalism in the New York Times, argues that the party's messaging on identity politics has ostracized white Americans, many of whom would otherwise be receptive to the party's economic policies. "It's crucial to develop a message that focuses on what we share," Lilla told me, "not on our identities at all, but what we share about certain principles in this country." Lilla argued that it's not that he doesn't care about identity politics issues. He said, for one, that he supports many of the efforts to expand and protect LGBTQ rights. But he argued that Democrats are going to be unable to do the work to expand and protect minority groups and women's rights if Democratic lawmakers are not in power first. It's an argument about strategy. It's not an argument about ultimate values, Lilla said. It's my attempt to get liberals' attention, and even progressives' attention, focused on winning elections. He added, "You can do nothing to protect black motorists pulled over by police and gay couples walking hand in hand down the street if you don't control Congress, and most importantly, if you don't have a voice in state legislatures." End quote. This all resonated pretty strongly with me when I read it, at least in part because during the week before we had hosted our guest speaker, Sarah Hayter, the co-founder of Ex-Muslims of North America, I was binging on her YouTube and podcast appearances, and she was saying some of the same things, but from a unique ex-Muslim perspective. Here are a few excerpts from her appearance at Portland State University on May 26, 2017, which you can find on YouTube. Quote, "We've put ourselves in a position, I think, where we will harm the very values we care about. For one, Islam is consistently treated as a race. And every time I bring this up and I say Islam is not a race, people think, well, of course not. Of course it's not a race, I know that. But we do treat it as a race. We use this word Islamophobia, which doesn't really make a lot of sense in any other context than a racialized one. It conflates the criticism of religion with the hatred for the people. And that makes conversations very difficult. That makes the conversation when you're talking about what may be issues within Islam. It makes it an inherently racist conversation. And it makes it something where racial attitudes are just infused in it, just because of the way the word is defined. We need to step away from this word. This word is not helpful. What we can use, and what we should use, is anti-Muslim bigotry, because Muslims do experience bigotry. What happens when we actually conflate these two concepts? Well, for one, it chills the conversation on Islam by convincing compassionate people who may be confused by the term to step away, to not voice the concerns that they may be having, because the reasoning goes, well, what if I'm adding to bigotry? What if I'm making things worse for Muslims that I care about? I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to speak up. And what happens is that these compassionate people in the middle, who really should be participating, who really should be talking about this issue, are the ones who silence themselves, that censor themselves. And what we're left with is two polar opposites that are just yelling noise at each other. We're not really having a conversation at all. So it's really important to make this distinction. Number two, I think it also puts Muslims in harm's way. If there isn't a strong, clear, totally crystallized distinction between the religion and the people, then any backlash to Islamic extremism will necessarily be taken out on the people, on Muslims. We're already seeing this kind of thinking being solidified in this idea that the only thing that we can do is we have to get rid of the Muslims. That's not true. What we're waging is an ideological battle, and this needs to be handled through reason, through compassion, through honesty, and through evidence. We need to view Muslim conservatism with the same suspicion that we view Christian conservatism, and use reason to argue against it, while remaining compassionate towards the people. And we need to view Muslims as people who can be persuaded. They're not a race. They are people who just happen to hold certain ideologies. Ex-Muslims are proof that there are people who believe certain things, and then they change their mind, and they adopt a different set of codes and values to live their life by. We're proof that change happens, and change happens even when there are dire consequences for change happening. I think we stand to lose a lot if we don't have this honest conversation, if we don't change our approach to Islam, and to the problem of conservatism specifically arising from Islam. People are losing trust in media, specifically in progressive media and in leftist media. I'm seeing this happening all the time. And I think this is very dangerous, particularly for progressives, particularly for people on the left, and for leftist values. People see that there's a hypocrisy here, that people treat Muslim conservatism differently than they would conservatism of any other religion, and they resent that. And then they lose trust in whatever institution that is displaying this hypocrisy. I fear that if this continues to happen, they will place their faith in people who are far worse, people who are actual bigots. This will mean that Muslims will suffer more in the end, because if there's only one person who's discussing the problem as it actually is, that's the person people are going to give their attention to. That's the person that people are going to now trust to find a solution, and we don't want that. We want it to be they're compassionate people, the people who care about Muslims and care about their civil liberties, to be there participating in this conversation. We don't want to lose the right to speak about this. I think that on a broader level, if we're going to be hypocrites when it comes to rights, particularly women's rights, in the broader context of human rights, we're losing something very important. In an effort to shield Muslims, to prevent Muslims from being targeted by bigotry, I think we're losing our ability to speak freely about problems as we see them. This is a danger in society. We need to be able to speak about this, and to know that we're not going to be slandered if we do. I also think that when we cower to religious demands in any way, we're losing our ability to fight for human rights. And in the end, that should be something that people on the left care about, that people who are liberal care about. Now, the reason I talk a lot about the left, and I talk a lot about liberalism, is because that's who I am. I'm a liberal. These liberal values are the values that moved me. And when I was leaving religion, those are the values that made me think that, okay, maybe I deserve more from society. Maybe I, as a woman, Sarah, should have equal rights as a man. I felt differently about it because of liberal values. I don't want these values to be eroded. I don't want them to be harmed. They will be if we're not going to be honest about these issues. End quote. For me, personally, Jack, it's this that's the most compelling argument against political correctness. I can't speak for the rest of people who vocally oppose political correctness. It's certainly possible that most of them really do just want to be able to say racist, sexist, or otherwise bigoted things without consequence. I haven't seen any studies on that either way. If you have, please point me in the right direction. But I don't want to cause my fellow human beings unnecessary suffering through careless speech. It may ruffle my feathers in the moment to be called out, of course. You know, I'm only human. But I'll get over it, and I'll take more care in my speech habits going forward. So that inconvenience, that social friction, isn't a compelling argument against political correctness to me. The most compelling argument against political correctness, in my view, is the erosion of trust in liberal institutions. Sarah took it a bit further in her appearance on January 11th, 2018, on a podcast called Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment, which is hosted by Ali Rizvi, the author of the book The Atheist Muslim, and Armin Navabi, the founder of the Atheist Republic. She says, quote, lefty ex-Muslims might think that, okay, the most important thing right now is to prevent the rise of the right, and whatever we can do, any tactic we can take, is worth it, because taking down the right is the most important thing. But I don't think that the ex-Muslim issues are singular in this respect, and that there have been ways that the left has been kind of playing denial in terms of reality, in terms of what science says, and what we know for sure, and just for the sake of not giving the right wing any ammunition. Just recently there's been this hoopla of Steven Pinker with his speech that he gave at Harvard. He was saying that there are certain people who otherwise are intelligent and otherwise are reasonable seeming people who find out something that it seems to them that the left has been keeping from them. And then when they see that one fact, that they don't feel like they can trust the left anymore, that the left hasn't been truthful to them, and they start paying more attention to the right wing, who has acknowledged that this inconvenient fact exists. What's interesting about the response to that video is that people have taken offense at him even acknowledging that this pattern exists. That even acknowledging that people see these realities and are so disturbed by the fact that they might have never heard this fact before, that it might lead them astray, and that the left really doesn't provide a lot of answers, that it might lead them to adopting alt-right criticisms. It's just so amazing to me that people find problems with him even articulating this phenomenon might exist. To truly say that he's wrong about this, you have to prove that this phenomenon doesn't exist, or something within his logic doesn't make sense. But instead, what they find a problem with is that he's articulating those facts at all. The exact point he was making, which is that the left doesn't want to articulate these facts because they're inconvenient to the overall narrative, and they don't want to explain, they don't want to contextualize these facts. That was his whole point. And people are still finding fault with him, even describing this phenomenon to begin with. I can't imagine how they think this is going to help the left wing. I honestly see this as being incredibly toxic and incredibly destructive to progressive politics. End quote. So that got me curious. What did Steven Pinker say that was so alarming? Well, let's see. The following comes from Steven Pinker speaking at Spike Magazine's Unsafe Space Tour, panel discussion at Harvard University. You can find the video on YouTube called Steven Pinker, Political Correctness Might Be Red-Pilling America. Quote, and this is Steven talking, political correctness has done an enormous amount of harm in the sliver of the population that might be, I wouldn't want to say persuadable, but certainly whose affiliation is up for grabs. It comes from often highly literate, highly intelligent people who gravitate to the alt-right, internet savvy, media savvy, who often are radicalized in that way, who swallow the red pill, as the saying goes, an allusion to the Matrix. When they're exposed the first time to true statements that have never been voiced in college campuses, or in the New York Times, or in respectable media, they're almost like a bacillus to which they have no immunity. And they're immediately infected with both the feeling of outrage that these truths are unsayable, and no defense against taking them to what we might consider to be rather repellent conclusions. Let me give you some examples. Here's a fact that's going to sound ragingly controversial, but is not. And that is that capitalist societies are better than communist ones. If you doubt it, then just ask yourself the question, would I rather live in South Korea or North Korea? Would I rather live in West Germany in the 70s or East Germany in the 60s? I submit that this is actually not a controversial statement, but in university campuses, it would be considered flamingly radical. Here's another one. Men and women are not identical in their life priorities, in their sexuality, in their tastes and interests. This is not controversial to anyone who has even glanced at the data. The kind of vocational interest tests of the kind that your high school guidance counselor gave you were given to millions of people, and men and women gave different answers as to what they want to do for a living, how much time they want to spend, allocate to family versus career, and so on. But you can't say it. A very famous person on this campus did say it, and we all know what happened to him. He's no longer, well, he's on the same campus, but no longer in the same office. Here's a third fact that is just not controversial, although it sounds controversial, and that is that different ethnic groups commit violent crimes at different rates. You can go to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, look it up on their website. The homicide rate among African Americans is about 7 or 8 times higher than it is among European Americans. And terrorism, go to the global terrorist database, and you find that worldwide, the overwhelming majority of suicide terrorist attacks are committed by Islamist extremist groups. If you've never heard these facts before, and you stumble across them, or someone mentions them, it's possible to come to some extreme conclusions, such as that women are inferior, that African Americans are naturally violent, and we all ought to be anarcho-capitalists and do away with regulation and social safety nets, and that most terrorism in the country is the fault of Muslims. These are all unwarranted conclusions, because for each one of these facts, there are very powerful counterarguments for why they don't license racism and sexism and anarcho-capitalism and anti-Muslim bigotry. The fact that men and women aren't identical has no implications for whether we should discriminate against women, for a number of reasons. One of them is that for any traits in which sex is different, and the two distributions have an enormous amount of overlap. So you can't draw reliable conclusions about any individual from group averages. Number two, the principle of opposition to racism and sexism is not a factual claim that the sexes and races are indistinguishable in every aspect. It's a political and moral commitment to treat people as individuals, as opposed to prejudging them by the statistics of their group. Third, we know that some of the statistical generalizations about races and sexes change over time. So what is true now may not necessarily be true in 10 or 20 years. These are all reasons why you can believe that the sexes are different and be a very strong feminist, and why you can believe that differences exist between races and be very strongly opposed to any form of racism. In the case of, say, rates of violent crime, they used to be, go back 100 years, the rate of violent crime among Irish Americans was far higher than among any other ethnic group. That obviously changed. There's no reason that that can't change in the case of current racial differences. In the case of terrorism, the majority of domestic terrorism is committed by right-wing extremist groups, not by Islamic groups within this country. Of course, through much of its history, Islam was far more enlightened than Christendom. There was no equivalent of the Inquisition. There was no equivalent of the wars of religion in the classical history of Islam. Finally, in the case of the fact that capitalism is really a better system than Marxism, every successful capitalist society has regulation, has a social safety net, and in fact, some of the countries with the strongest social safety nets are also the countries that are the most market-friendly and that have the greatest degree of economic freedom. These are all reasons why you can believe all of these facts and not necessarily drift towards extremist positions. In fact, why you can be a progressive, a centrist, a liberal, even a leftist, and believe all of these. Because you're exposed not only to the facts, but how to put them in context. Now let's say that you've never heard anyone mention these facts. The first time you hear them, you're apt to say, number one, the truth has been withheld from me by universities, by mainstream media, and moreover, you'll be vindicated when people who voice these truths are suppressed, shouted down, and assaulted. All the more reason to believe that the left and the mainstream media, that universities can't handle the truth. So you get vindicated over and over and over. But worst of all, you're never actually exposed to the ways of putting these facts into context so that they don't lead to racism and sexism and extreme forms of anarcho-libertarianism. So the politically correct left is doing itself an enormous disservice when it renders certain topics undiscussable, especially when the facts are clearly behind them, because they leave people defenseless the first time they hear them against the most extreme and indefensible conclusions possible. If they are exposed, then the rationale for putting them into proper political and moral context could also be articulated. And I don't think you would have quite the extreme backlash. End quote. So it seems to me, Jack speaking, it seems to me that if we want to make sure that we don't give the right wing any ammunition, the approach of denying reality is a serious mistake. And denying facts that we know about reality, facts that can be discovered by studying them, and will be discovered by anyone who looks, that's what we're doing. giving ammunition to the right. By pretending not to know what we do know, by pretending that reality is different than it is, we're setting ourselves up for the accusation that we're covering up some profound truth, some forbidden fruit, what the liberals don't want you to know. There's no denying that there are scientific facts that can be misused to cause people harm and justify discrimination and oppression, but it doesn't follow that therefore we should suppress knowledge. A response that is more consistent with our values would be to make sure to contextualize that knowledge properly, to do follow-up studies to uncover more context, and to continually work to put things into the proper context whenever we see others taking them out of context. This is hard work, and it's never ending. But that's not a reason not to do it. The alternative is nothing more than science denialism, which is unacceptable. We rag on the ignorant who deny evolution, deny climate change, on flat earthers and anti-vaxxers. It's the same idea. If we want to be consistent, we should draw the line here and say, look, atheism isn't a religion, it's a personal relationship with reality. And I'm committed to follow the evidence where it leads, even if that contradicts the narrative of my tribe. Even the Dalai Lama has gone so far as to say that if scientific analysis were to conclusively demonstrate certain claims in Buddhism to be false, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon those claims. So let's commit ourselves to not contribute to the erosion of trust in liberal institutions by pretending that reality is different than it is. The cause of social justice is too important for us to let that continue. So, I'm going to leave it there for today. There's plenty of things to talk about during our group discussion. As always, I want to be wrong for the shortest possible time. So if there's something I'm missing, please do let me know either during the discussion or come see me afterwards. And if, from your perspective, you see what I said as just status quo apologism for some right-wing, racist, sexist bullshit, I want to know that too. Because I really don't see it that way. And if I'm missing something that important, I want to know.